Welcome to Sewing Anastasia, and today we're going to create the Pashia dress, which is a pattern from my sewing club. And there's a few cool things about the sewing club. When you join, you get a discount on patterns. Plus, we have a Discord community where you can pop in, ask a question, get an opinion, ask for help on this project or another project you're working on. We are there to support you. It's an all-inclusive community for your sewing needs. And you get exclusive access to the new pattern for the first 30 days if you're a part of the sewing club. Otherwise, after that, you can download it from the website. And you're going to notice that this video is going to be a little different than my normal YouTube videos because this is a sewing tutorial that's in the sewing club. So you're going to see that it's laid out by chapters. So if you get the pattern, you can follow along to this video to sew it up. And if you're not sewing the pattern right now, that's okay. You are going to learn a bunch of awesome stuff and tips about sewing and also some pattern manipulations. So let's get into it. Let's start creating this Pashia dress. Welcome to this month's pattern of the month. We're going to be making the Pashia dress. It is a shirt dress that has a really fun side hip gathers, and it has a collar and a fantastic sleeve on it. The sleeve has a fun style line cutting on an angle, and then it has a gathered back puff sleeve along with a nice little cuff. The back has beautiful princess lines, giving you a nice smooth back with that hip puff continuing to the back. One of my favorite features of this design are the beautiful princess lines contouring the body. And it has these amazing pockets. Who doesn't love a dress with pockets? The pattern comes in sizes 0 through 38. And over here, the purple dress is a sample in a size 24. In this dress here, I have modified. So I've taken the pattern and then created kind of a new style with it by removing the top collar, rounding out the top pointed edge, ironing back the lapels, and then I've added this really fun ruffle, extra ruffle on top of the gathered hip ruffle. So you can really have a lot of fun with this pattern and making it all your own. Oh, and I also shortened this one as well. And one of the pattern hacks I'm gonna go over for this dress is how to make it sleeveless. So that way you can enjoy this dress all year long. We're gonna go over how to modify that pattern and finish the edge with a professional look. And the other pattern hack we're gonna go over for the Pashia dress is how to add trim or ruffles to existing seams. And that's one of the great things about the sewing club is that you also learn how to modify the patterns and make the design your own style. And this dress can be made out of any light to medium weight fabric. Think of a chambray or a flannel for fall, maybe a silk organza or a silk satin for a fancy event, or maybe you want to keep it casual and just go with a rayon challis print. It's really up to you with the fabric that you choose. Just make sure it's something in the light to medium weight because if it gets too heavy, the gathers aren't going to sit very well in the hip section. But the sky is the limit. Have fun and get creative. I'm so happy you're here in the sewing club. Let's start creating our Pashia dress. Now it's time to prepare the pattern, and the first thing we need to do is print it out. And you have two options there. There's the home printer version, which you can print out at home and cut and tape together, or the large format version, which you can send to a print shop and get a nice large print. Totally up to you. And if you need help with any of those, make sure you check out the video there listed down below. Once you have your pattern printed, it's time to find your size. So make sure you're measuring the fullest part of your bust, your natural waist, and you can measure your hips as well. But the hip in this is free because it is full in the hip. There's a bunch of gathers in it, so it's not a fitted measurement there. So really you just need your bust and your waist. And if you need to grade your pattern because you're falling in between a few different sizes, make sure you reference the grading video. There'll be a link for that. Now let's go over the pattern pieces you should have now that your pattern is sized and cut out. You should have the top sleeve, which is going to be cut 2. You're going to have the bottom sleeve, which is cut 2. And then you're going to have this giant skirt side, and it is cut 4 for those beautiful gathers. You're also going to have the front side, which is cut 2. Your back side is cut 2. Now your back center is cut 1 on fold. So really make sure you're placing that one on fold. And we have the front center, which is cut 2, our front facing, which is cut 2, our pocket, which is cut 4, and then our back neck facing here is cut 1 on fold. So we have another one on fold. And then our collar pattern is going to be cut 2 on fold. So this is another one on fold. And then our cuff pattern here is cut 4. You're also gonna need to cut some interfacing, and these pieces right here are the ones you need to cut interfacing for. So your front facing, you need to cut 2 interfacing. Your cuff is cut 2 interfacing. Your collar is cut 1 interfacing on fold, and then your back neck facing is cut 1 interfacing on fold as well. And now that your pattern is prepared, you're going to need to gather your supplies. You're going to need some fabric, interfacing, and buttons. It's time to have some fun with buttons. For the buttons, you can put the same amount that's on the pattern, or you could put more or less, totally up to you. And for the exact fabric requirements, make sure you check it out on the pattern. That'll tell you exactly how much you need. And once you have all of your fabric and interfacing cut out, it's time to fuse the interfacing to the fabric. When you're putting the interfacing on, you want to attach it to the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to be using fusible interfacing today, so the side that has the glue dots on it is going to go on the wrong side. And I have my piece of muslin on the ironing board so I don't get glue on anything. And I'm also going to put the muslin on top of the interfacing so I don't get glue on my iron. Give that a nice steam, and now we have our piece nice and interface. So you're going to do the same thing for all the pieces that require interfacing. Once you have all your fabric cut out and your interfacing fused, you are ready to start sewing. I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to make this dress sleeveless, because it would be so cute without sleeves on it, or you could even wear like a turtleneck with it, wear the collar open. It really gives you a lot of options for styling if you make it sleeveless. And this here is a sample I'm working on to make sleeveless. So if you want to make your dress sleeveless, sew it up without the sleeve on it, obviously. And you can do this last, or you can do it right after you sew up the shell here of the dress. So you want to try it on, and we want to figure out what shape of armhole do we want. Now you probably don't want the edge of the shoulder coming all the way out to the tip of your shoulder. You could totally just leave this armhole as is and finish it. But I'm going to suggest that you come in about 1 inch from the shoulder and then draw a nice smooth shape down to the underarm. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw a new shape for the armhole, making sure it's nice and smooth and connecting with the underarm. Now you could drop the underarm, but I wouldn't suggest it just because you don't want to end up seeing into like the side of your dress, but it's totally up to you. Maybe you want to go for that summer vibe with a really low armhole. So I'm going to sketch out where I want my new armhole, about 1 inch in, and then I'm going to blend this over. So this is the front, and I'm going to do the same thing for the back. So I'm going to turn it to the back, and then I'm going to blend this out to the back. Curve. There we go. So I'm blending this right to the underarm there. So now I have my new armhole drawn out that I would like. So here's the top of my shoulder, and you can see I have a pretty smooth line there connecting the front to the back, but you can always use your French curve. And you want the very top of the shoulder here to be straight and then start curving out. So if you are going to use a French curve, use the straight part of it up here at the top where it has a little bit of a curve, but it's mainly straight. And then I want you to take your bodice and fold it at the shoulder there, so that way we can see the back armhole. Get it to lay as flat as you can because it is sewn up. Now I'm going to use the French curve. The dipped part, the curly part of the French curve goes towards your armhole. And then we're going to line up the straighter part of the French curve with your shoulder. And then we can draw this line in here if you need to true it up a little bit, just so you can get a really smooth armhole. So now I have a nice smooth line from the bottom all the way up to the top of the shoulder on the back. And I'm going to do the same thing for the front. So on the front, I'm placing the ruler the same way, the straighter side at the tip of the shoulder and the curved part at the bottom of the armhole. And I just want this to be nice and smooth. And there's my new line. We just trued it up just a little bit. So now this line right here is where I wanted it to be when I was trying it on. And since I am finishing this with bias facing, it will come in like 1/8 or 1/4 inch more because there is a seam allowance on the bias tape. So if you really do want it exactly right there, just extend your cut line by 1/4 of an inch. but I'm gonna leave it right where it's at on my chalk line, and I'm just gonna be cutting the chalk line one layer at a time because the front and the back armhole are different shapes. You can see that when I lift that up here. A lot of times I just like to clip into the shoulder, and then I will start working my way around one side of the armhole here. Now I'll flip it over for the other side. And there we go. Here's the piece that we ended up taking off of the dress for the armhole. So this little piece we cut off, do not throw it out or give it to the cat because we need it. We are going to be using it as a template on the other side of the dress. So the way we're gonna do this is we're gonna make sure we're placing right sides together. I'm gonna line it up at the shoulder first. I'm gonna put a pin in it, so I'm pinning it to the current dress, and I'm just gonna line up those edges around the armhole. So this is essentially my little template that I'm using to make sure I cut off the same amount on the right side of the dress as I do the left side. So now I'll just continue to the back of the armhole. Now that we have that pinned on, it's time to cut away. So we're just gonna cut right next to the edge of that piece of fabric, all the way around. So I'm just gonna be cutting right here next to the template, but you could also chalk out next to it, remove the piece, and then cut if that's easier for you. There we go. Now we have taken off the exact same amount on the other side by using that little piece as a template. Now, before we do anything else, we want to go back and reinforce any of the seams that we cut through so that way they don't start falling apart when we're attaching our bias facing. Now you're going to do this by adding a back stitch to the last like ½ inch of the seam. We just need to reinforce that seam so that way it doesn't fall apart. So it's going to look like that with that extra back stitch in there. Now you're gonna do that to all your seams that you cut through. So I reinforced my seams and I put it back on the dress form just to double check, make sure it's fitting how I wanted. Obviously you would try it on yourself, make sure the armhole is fitting how you want it. Now we're ready to finish it off with our bias facing. Currently using a 5/8 inch single fold bias tape. So if you haven't done this before, I'm gonna run through the steps with you. First thing we're gonna do is take our bias tape, we're gonna open up one fold. I'm gonna start at the side seam. I'm gonna let a ½ inch of the bias tape hang beyond the side seam there. So I'm gonna open up that fold and I'm gonna pin the bias tape, right side of the bias tape on the right side of the fabric. And we're gonna pin this all the way around the armhole. And then we're gonna go and sew right in that crease there that we've opened up that was hiding under the fold. So when we get back to the beginning, we are just going to pin all the way over to that seam allowance. And right now, I'm just going to leave the extra bias tape hanging at that underarm seam. So I have my straight stitch set to a regular stitch length for my fabric type. And we're stitching right in that fold. Now we get back to that underarm seam. I want you to stop sewing right at it. Don't go beyond it. You can add a back stitch. So you can see both of our pieces of binding are meeting right there at the underarm seam. So what we need to do is sew at a 45-degree angle with the binding open from where we left off stitching up to the other side, sewing it to this piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw a 45-degree angle on this piece of binding. So you could get a ruler, you can take the piece of binding and fold it over so you get a 45-degree angle, and then just crease it with your finger. And now you can see that 45-degree angle, and I'll put some chalk there. There's the 45-degree angle, but I want it down here. So we're gonna drop it a 1/4 inch. There we go. So there's our 45-degree angle. Now we need to line it up with the other piece. And I dropped it the 1/4 of an inch just because I needed to start where my last stitch is. So now what we're gonna do is take the other piece and we're gonna place it at a 90-degree angle, making sure we don't get any bubbles or anything down there. And I'm gonna put a pin in here to keep these two together. And now when I flip this over, we're going to sew these two pieces of binding together right on that line that I drew, that 45-degree angle. Back stitch at the end. So now you can cut off the excess. Leave a seam allowance though, leave about a 1/4 of an inch. Cut your threads. And now let's flip it back and see the magic. And now when we flip it back, you can see we have that nice seam there connecting the binding at a 45. Now we have 2 steps left for a very professional finish. We're going to understitch the binding and then we're going to edge stitch it down to the inside. First, we are going to push our seam allowance towards the binding and then we're going to add a little understitch on the binding called an understitch because it's going to help keep it under. And we are attaching the seam allowance to the binding. And then after that, we're going to take the whole piece of binding and we're going to push it to the inside and then we're going to add an edge stitch right there at the edge so that way the binding stays to the inside and we're going to have a beautiful finish at our armhole. So I turned the binding to the inside of the garment and I pinned it down. And now we're ready for that last stitch, which is going to be the edge stitch. I'm gonna back stitch at the end and now we're all done. So I did the same thing to the other side and now our armholes are nice and finished. So you can see we have that beautiful clean finish all around the edge and then we have that bias facing there on the inside. So if you're looking to make your dress sleeveless, this is a great technique to use. And you can use this technique on any top that you wanna make sleeveless. In this lesson, I'm gonna go over a technique that you might wanna use in your dress. This technique's really awesome and you can use it on any pattern and it elevates the look of your garment. Today, I'm going to be inserting this little piece of crochet trim into a collar seam, but it could be piping, it could be lace, it could be rickrack, any sort of trim that you have, you can put it in any seam on a garment. Imagine adding this nice little detail to a princess line, the placket of a shirt, or a waist seam. It's amazing how this technique can really elevate the look of any design. So let me show you how this works on a collar. And we're not just adding this lace to a straight seam, I'm gonna show you how to add the lace to a corner or a point. So that's why I'm demoing on a collar today. So here's my collar pattern cut out. I've got my top and my bottom collar and my piece of interfacing, and I'm going to fuse my interfacing to my under collar, the bottom piece of the collar. So if you're inserting the lace into, let's say, the princess seam, you're not going to have interfacing there. This interfacing is just part of the collar. Using a fusible interfacing today, and I'm just going to be fusing this down with steam. You should always be using a pressing cloth, but I just really want you to be able to see it, so I'm not using one. And now my under collar is nice and reinforced. Now it's time to start adding our lace, and I'm going to be attaching it first to the collar piece with the interfacing. And if you're not working on a collar, you can attach it to either side of your seam. Now when I'm doing this, I like to go through and attach it to just one piece first. So that way I can basically baste it on so I know it's not going to move when I attach the other layer. And if you're adding lace to a collar, you want to add it to the short side, the long side, and the other short side. Make sure you're not adding it to the bottom edge, the curved edge, because that part's going to attach to your neck. So you're basically adding the lace where you want to see it on the outside of the garment. When applying the lace, we're going to apply it backwards, and you'll see why in just a little bit. So right now I have the edge facing inside that I want to be on the outside later. Now I'm going to pin the lace to the collar. And I've made sure to extend the lace off the edge so I can be sure that I'm going to have it caught by the bottom. Now when we get up to the corner, I want to make sure that I am folding it back on itself. And when you do this, make sure you're folding it the right way So that way everything is facing here towards the inside. So you can see how I'm putting this little pleat in it. I'm folding it on top of itself. And this is going to help us later for when it flips out. So no matter what the shape of the seam, you're going to be following the edge with your trim. Since I have another corner here, I also need to make sure that I'm putting the fold in. Now that I'm at the end of the seam, I can cut off the excess trim. Now we're ready to sew it down. I have my machine set to a basting stitch, which is a temporary stitch. It's a straight stitch with a long stitch length. So I'm going to be sewing right in the middle of this narrow piece of trim here at the edge, about 1/8 of an inch away, because I don't want to risk seeing it on the outside of my project later. And my seam allowance here is 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to be sewing this down at 1/8. Needle down, foot up and turn. When you get to those corners, really make sure everything is tucked over, essentially creating a 45-degree angle there with your fold. And now take out your project. Now I'm going to take the other color and place it right sides together right over the lace. And if this was a different seam you were putting lace into, you would just be placing right sides together. And now I'm going to pin the edges together, making sure everything is nice and lined up. And now we're going to go sew the edges together that we just put the lace in, and I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance because that's what my pattern calls for. So you would use whatever seam allowance your pattern calls for. So I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch away from the edge because that's where my seam allowance is. Now get to the bottom back stitch and let's take a look. Now it's time to reveal the lace. But before we do that, let's clip our corners. So I'm just going to clip off these corners just to reduce a little bit of the bulk here. And that's just something you're gonna do if you have a corner. If you have a straight seam, no need to do that because you don't have a corner. So now we're gonna flip it right side out and then we will be able to see the lace. So now you can see the beautiful detail of lace that's popping out at the side. I'm gonna go iron this collar and then we'll take a close look at it. So now you can see we have that beautiful little crochet lace detail right around the collar. And we have these beautiful little corners because of the way we folded our lace. Now that you know how to add a trim to a seam, you can add it to the collar or any seams on the dress. It makes a really nice complement and adds some detail. Now it's time to start sewing. Let's start with those shoulder seams. So here I've got center back and then I have my 2 front panels. So what we're gonna do to both of these is fold them right sides together and we're going to sew the shoulders together with a 1/2 inch seam. So pin those together. I'm gonna pin both sides while I'm here. Now let's go sew them together. And again, we're sewing this with a 1/2 inch seam. Now that that one's finished, I'm gonna move on to the other one. And now we're done with our shoulders. Now that I've sewn the seam together, I'm gonna serge it together to finish the edges. So let's finish off these edges. Now they're beautifully finished. For this project, I'm going to be sewing my seams together and then serging them together. But you don't have to follow that exact process. You could serge all your edges first, You could zigzag, overcast, you could bias bind some of your edges in this project, or create French seams, whatever you're comfortable with really. Now that our shoulders are sewn up and finished, it's time to move on to the side seams on the bodice section. Now you're gonna get your front bodice and your back bodice, and we're gonna sew them together at the side seams here. So we're gonna take a front and a back, and we're gonna lay them on top of each other, and we're going to pin and sew up the side seam here. And we're going to do the same thing to both sets. So also placing these right sides together and pinning together the side seams. Again, your seam allowance at the side seam is a 1/2 inch. Now it's time to serge that seam together. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Since my seam allowances are serged together, I need to iron my seam over to one side. I can't iron it open. I'm going to be ironing my seam towards the back panel. This has a little bit of a curve, so I want to make sure I don't get any creases in it. That's why I'm holding it up like that. I always like to check from the outside. Usually give it a little hit of steam from the outside, and we are looking beautiful. I'm also going to do the same thing to my shoulder seams while I'm here. Now that we're done with these side panels, we need to work on the skirt section that sews to the bottom of it. And we're going to start by adding our inseam pockets first. Over these next few steps, I'm going to be attaching the side seam pockets to our big gathered panel at the side, and then we're going to attach it to the side panel. So we're going to gather up our fabric and attach it to the side panel, and we'll essentially end up with one whole side of the dress, and then we need to do the exact same thing to the other side. So while you're sewing, you can repeat the same steps for the other side at the same time, or you can sew up one side completely and then sew up the other side completely. So I have my pockets laid out on the longer short side of these really big panels. So if you are to fold this panel in half, you can see that one is shorter than the other one. They are supposed to be like that because of the curve in the design. So we want to make sure that we are adding the pockets to that longer side seam. Before we start attaching the pockets, I want you to just serge the outside of the pocket, and then we'll start attaching. Now that we have these serged, it's time to position them. And I'm going to be positioning them 2 inches down from the top. So we're going to start the pocket 2 inches down, and then we can start pinning it to that side seam. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other one, 2 inches down. And now we're going to sew the pocket to the side seam here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to sew this up with our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the end. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the other one. And then I'm going to serge the entire side seam. We now have our pockets attached, that entire side seam serged together, and now I've ironed the pockets out nice and flat. Our next step is to add the understitch on the pocket. So we want to make sure that that seam allowance here is faced out. Our pocket goes over the seam allowance, and we stitch the seam allowance to the edge of the pocket. This helps keep the pocket to the inside of the garment while we're wearing it. So I'm now going to add that little edge stitch to the pocket, which is called an understitch. Back stitch at the end, and now I'm going to do the same thing to that other pocket. Our little edge stitch is looking great here, holding down everything nicely. Now we're going to take the side seams and we're going to place them right sides together, lining up everything. So we are going to line up the top, line up the pockets, line up the bottom, and we're going to pin everything together here. It's really important to make sure the top of your pockets are lining up. Make sure the edges of your pockets are lining up around these curves. When we sew, we're gonna start at the top. We're gonna come down a 1/2 inch into the pocket. We're gonna sew around the pocket. And when you get to that stitch that you can see where we sewed the pocket together, you're gonna pivot and sew down the side seam. Your seam allowance here is a 1/2 inch. I'm gonna start at the bottom, work my way up. Again, I'm coming a 1/2 inch up into the pocket, needle down, foot up, and I'm going to pivot. And I'm gonna work my way all the way around the curve of this pocket. Come all the way over to the stitch you can see where you made the seam for the pocket, and then needle down, foot up, and pivot to continue sewing up the side seam. Back stitch. So we have everything nice and sewn up, but there's one last step. So the bottom of the pocket is open right now, and we want to sew this up. So I'm going to recommend that you measure 6 inches down from the top of the pocket there. And now we're going to sew from where this pin is down to the side seam where we pivoted. Now put your hand here, make sure you can fit your hand in here. You can always make this opening bigger or smaller. I'm going to start at the bottom of the pocket, back stitch. I'm going to make sure I'm just 1 stitch outside of that original stitching line. I'm going to come up to where the pin was, add some back stitches, and now we're done with the pocket. So now we have our beautiful inset pocket in our side seam, and our hand goes easily in our pocket, and you can see how nice and big and spacious our pocket is. Now it's time to gather up some fabric. We're going to be gathering up the top edge of the piece of fabric. Now you can use basting stitches, but a lot of times basting stitches kind of break when you have a lot of fabric that you're gathering up. I'll link a video down below for how to gather with basting stitches. I'll also link a video down below on how to gather with a zigzag stitch, which is great for long lengths of fabric. So if you don't have a gathering foot or you don't want to buy one, definitely use the zigzag method over the basting method, but they both work. So let's go over how to set up your machine for the gathering foot. And the gathering foot's really amazing because once we set up our sewing machine settings, all we need to do is run our fabric through. So for adjustments when using the gathering foot, you want to make your stitch length as long as it'll go. If you're looking for the max gather, and I want to gather the heck out of this, so I'm going to turn up all of my settings. I'm going to make my foot pressure as high as it'll go, and I'm also going to increase the thread tension. I'm going to go up to 9. Okay, so now that I have those settings changed over, my stitch length, my foot pressure, and my thread tension, it's time to sew. Now that our settings are set, it's time to run the fabric through the machine. I'm going to be placing my fabric right next to the edge of the foot, so that way my stitch line is going to be within my 1/2 inch because I don't want to have to seam rip that out later, and I don't want to see it on the outside of my project. So now we can just gather up our fabric. This magic foot is going to do everything. Now we've made it to the end and we're all done gathering. Look at how awesome this gather is. It gathered it all up just like that. So quick and easy. I love the gathering foot. Now you might be wondering, how do I get the fabric to gather up the perfect length? Well, there is a way to figure this out with your machine. So what I recommend doing is cutting a length of fabric. It can be 10 inches, 12 inches, whatever you like. And then gather it up and see how short does it get. And then you'll know, okay, for every 10 inches of fabric I have, it's going to turn into 3 or it's going to turn into 4. So then you just got to math it out depending on the settings for your machine. So really, it's quite simple. Now that we have that skirt section gathered, we're going to sew it to the side panel. So we're going to sew it to this bottom curve down here. First, we're going to line up the side seam on the skirt with the seam on the bodice here, because we want everything to stay nice and balanced. And then when I'm gathering, I always like to pin the ends. And then I'll pin within. So then I know I just need to pin that together. So now I'll pin this end. Now that I have that all pinned up, we're going to sew this edge together with a 1/2 inch seam. Again, your seam allowance here is a 1/2 inch. Make sure you put all your settings back to your normal settings for the fabric you're using. Now your gathers, just make sure that they're all staying perpendicular to the stitch you're creating, because we don't want any of them to get tucked back or tucked under, and sometimes they like to do that. So really manipulate them as you're sewing if you need to. Back stitch at the end. And now we're going to serge that seam together. So that way it's going to help flatten it out a little as well. So here we have the gathers sewn on to that waistline there. And I also serged that seam together. So this piece looks like this on the inside, and it looks like this on the outside. Now grab the center front and center back panels that are sewn together at the shoulders, and we're going to insert the side panels in the princess lines. I'm going to be working with my center back panel first. So this line right here is our princess line, and I'm going to take the side panel that has the back princess line panel on it, and we're going to sew these two together. So I'm going to flip it over so I can match my right sides together. I'm going to start pinning up here at the princess line and then work my way all the way down to the hem. Now, when you're working with the curves here, you really want to make sure that you are not stretching or pulling your fabric, because it is on a curve, it's hitting that bias point and it could stretch out. So you want to be really careful that you're not stretching out your fabric here. Now I have this entire side pinned up, and it's time to go sew it together. Your seam allowances on the princess lines are a 1/2 inch, so be sure to be following a 1/2 inch. Now that we're finished with that seam, let's serge the edges together. Now I have my seam nice and serged together all the way down that back princess line. So I flipped around the dress so you can see my center front panel is over here. The center back is here. This is the one we just sewed together. Now what we need to do is sew together the front princess line. So we're going to be matching this seam up and pinning it together. So you can see how this side panel comes together. Now that we've got it all pinned up, let's go sew it up. Don't forget the back stitch, and again, your seam allowance here is a 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to serge the seam together. So as you can see here, we've attached this center side panel to the back and the front princess lines down the side. And now we're going to do the same thing to the other side. So now the whole shell of our dress is sewn up, and I've ironed my seams. So the princess line seams in the back get ironed towards center back, and the princess line seams in the front get ironed towards center front. The shell of the dress is looking so fantastic. I just love the silhouette. Next, we are going to add the collar and the facing to center front. To sew up the collar, we're just going to place them right sides together, and we are going to sew up the short sides and the long side. We are going to leave this side here that's curved outward open. So let's pin together our layers. Also, at this point, one side of your collar should already be interfaced. You could interface both sides if you want to have a really stiff collar. Okay, so now we are going to start here. We are going to sew these 3 sides with a 1/4 inch seam. Make sure you're back stitching. If you haven't engaged your needle down button today, make sure you engage it. So when you get to the corner, needle down, foot up, and turn. Back stitch at the bottom. Now I'm going to clip the corners off and flip the collar right side out and give it a nice press. And if your corners are being tricky, you can always use a little pusher, push something in there to get your corners to come out. Or you can also take the edges, roll them in your fingers, and they should pop out as well. Now that my corners are popped out, I'm going to press my seams nice and flat. Now that everything's nice and pressed flat, it's time to top stitch it. We're going to top stitch both layers together, 1/4 inch away from the edge, on sides that we just sewed up. When you get to the corners, make sure you're leaving your needle in, lifting up your foot and turning. And now our collar is beautifully top stitched. Now we're going to sew the collar to the neckline. So we need to find the center of the collar and the center of the neckline. The easiest way to do this is fold them both in half and find the center. So I'm going to fold the collar in half. I'm going to put a pin here at center. I'm also going to fold the back neck in half, lining up the shoulders. Now that I have both of the centers marked, I'm going to pin from the center out. And we're going to be pinning right sides together. So we're pinning the edge of the collar that has not been sewn together to the edge of the neckline. And when you get to the shoulder seams, you want to make sure that your seams are either pressed open or pressed to the back. And since I serged my seams together, I'm making sure that my shoulder seam is pressed to the back. Now, because you do have a curve around the neck, make sure you're not stretching out your neck when you are attaching the collar. You can always stay stitch your neckline first if you are having a problem with it stretching out on you. So now I have half of it pinned and we're going to pin the other half, working out from center. Now that I have the collar pinned to the neckline, we're going to sew it together with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm starting at the back of the collar and sewing all the way around. Get to the end and back stitch. Now I have the collar attached and it's looking gorgeous on the inside and on the outside. Now we're going to work on our facing and attaching it to the dress. First thing we need to do is sew the shoulder seams together. So here I have the back neck facing and then here I have the 2 center front facing. So we're going to place right sides together and we're just going to sew up this short little seam here. And the seam allowance here is a 1/2 inch. And then we're going to do the same thing over here on this side, sewing it up with a 1/2 inch seam. I'm going to sew this together with a 1/2 inch seam and then I'm going to iron open the seam to keep it nice and flat at the shoulder. After that, I'm going to go all the way around the outer edge of the facing with the serger. Now at this step, you could bias bind that edge, which would look so nice on the inside, or zigzag it or choose a way to finish that edge, because the outer edge of the facing is not enclosed in a seam. So now that those are sewn, I'm going to iron them open. So you can see we have the shoulder seam sewn up, we have them ironed open, and I have the serge going just around the outside of the facing. Now grab the shell of your dress and we're going to attach that facing all the way around the outside. To attach the facing on the dress, we're going to line it up right sides together, lining up the straight edges up center front, and the curved part's going to go around the neck. And I've got some helpful tips here to make sure this lays nice and flat for you. So I'm going to turn it around so you can see it really well. So to make this tight curve lay along the back neck here really nice through all the layers, it can be a little tricky. So if you're new to curves, what I want you to do is draw in your seam allowance. Your seam allowance here is 1/4 inch. Now that I have the seam allowance drawn in, we can clip to the seam allowance, stopping right before it, and it's gonna help release the tension in this curve, making it easier to sew. So I'm going to take my little snips and I'm gonna snip right in to the line, but I'm gonna make sure I'm stopping before I get to that 1/4 inch line, because we need to be able to sew on that 1/4 inch line. And so what this is going to do is when we're laying it on there, you're gonna notice the little snips open up. It's gonna help release the tension there and make it easier to sew. To line this up, I'm gonna start by lining up the shoulder seams. So find the shoulder seams on your dress with the shoulder seams on the facing, and we want to line those up. And now I can pin in the center back in between those two shoulder seams. And you can see how those little clips do open up a little bit, releasing that tension. So now I'm going to pin all the way over to the corner here, and then just make sure you're pinning within and make sure that your collar isn't like sinking down, because it's going to want to, because it's a heavier fabric with all that interfacing than just the front layer right now. And just pull everything up to line up. Now I'm pinning from the other side over to the shoulder. After you've completed the neck, now we're going to pin the center fronts together. So now you're gonna line up the center front edges and pin them together all the way down. And you're gonna do this on both sides. Now that the facing's pinned all the way around the front and the neck, we're going to sew it up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's right, we're gonna sew everywhere we just pinned. I'm starting at the right angle at center front, and then I'm gonna work my way around the neck. I'm going to back stitch at the corner, and then I'm going to reposition to come down center front. I have really delicate fabric, so those extra back stitches are just going to make sure nothing comes apart when we clip it later. When you get down to the hem, we're going to turn. We get a 1/2 inch away from the hem, needle down, foot up, and you're just going to sew over to the edge of the facing. Add a few back stitches. We turn the right corner at the bottom, so it's going to look nicer when we hem it later. So we'll get to that later on. Now I'm going to sew up the other side, starting at the top, working down, so that way all the fabric pushes from the top down in case we accidentally get any fabric that moves around. Again, at the bottom, I'm going to turn when I'm a 1/2 inch away from that bottom edge. And now we're done attaching the facing. Now we're going to clip the top and the bottom corner, so that way when we flip the facing to the inside, we're going to get that really beautiful point there. And we're going to do this to both sides of the dress. So clip those corners, and then we're going to flip it all to the inside. Now we're going to take that facing and we are going to push it to the inside of the dress, and make sure you get a really nice corner there. And now we're going to iron that facing towards the inside. And since I have a bubbly seam here, I'm gonna iron it flat and then I'm gonna push it to the inside. So now I have it pretty flat. And now I'm gonna fold the facing towards the inside and iron it so that way the seam is right there at the outside. And now we're going to continue that and go all the way around the facing. Let's check out our facing and talk about what our next step is. Now our facing is all ironed towards the inside, around the neck and down center front. Now it's time to move onto the hem. So you can see the center front is finished off real nice with that facing. And for this dress, we're going to give it a 1/4 inch rolled hem. So we're going to roll it up 1/4 and 1/4, and it is going to start inside under the facing. Let me get rid of these little serge tails. So you can even like pop this out, your little facing piece, and you can start the rolled hem inside of there. It's going to make it so much easier. And then when you push that back, automatically it's going to start rolling it to the inside of the garment. So in this process, we're going to start hemming, and then when we get all the way around to the facing, we're going to sew all the way around our facing 1/4 inch away from the edge. So we're going to be finishing the hem and sewing down the top stitch on the facing at the same time. So we're literally going all the way around the garment. I'm going to start at the corner of the dress on the facing, following 1/4 inch. Here we are back on the facing. We're at the bottom. We're going to come down to the corner, needle down, foot up and turn. We're going to add that 1/4 inch top stitch all the way around the facing, even at the neck. When you're going around the neck, make sure you're keeping everything nice and flat because it is a strong curve. Things like to get caught under there. So keep it nice and flat. We're back to where we started. I'm going to add a few back stitches and let's take a look at it. So now we have the whole facing on the dress and it's looking great inside and out. Now it's time to sew our sleeves. So grab all of your sleeve pieces. There's a bottom to the sleeve, a top to the sleeve, and then 2 cuff pieces. First thing we're going to do is sew the top of the sleeve to the bottom of the sleeve on this angle here. So we're sewing this inward curve of the sleeve to the angle. So you can see we're going to straighten that out and sew it down. So we're going to flip it right sides together and we're going to pin these 2 edges together. And since you do have an angle and then an inward curve, be really careful that you don't stretch these out. Now we're going to sew from end to end with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the end, and now I'm going to serge that seam together. Now that I've finished that edge with the serge, we're going to top stitch that seam down. So we need to make sure we're pushing that seam allowance down towards the bottom of the sleeve, and we're going to add the top stitch on the bottom of the sleeve, making sure we're catching that seam allowance. So again, I'm adding a top stitch to the bottom of the sleeve. Your top stitch is 1/4 inch away from the seam. Back stitch at the bottom, and now we're done with that step. Now that we have that top stitch in there, we're going to sew our underarm seam. So we're going to take this long edge and fold it over here to the other long edge. We're going to pin this together and then we're going to sew it up at a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to serge the seam together. Now it's time to serge. You can see we have that underarm seam sewn and serged together, and it looks so nice where it intersects with the other seam. Now we're gonna move on to the cuffs. Now we're gonna take the cuffs and we're gonna place them right sides together, and we're going to sew up the sides here, making sure you pivot where this point is. Your seam allowance here is 1/2 inch. Now that we have the cuffs sewn together, we want to iron the seam allowances open at the side. So the easiest way to do this is get your sleeve board. And if you don't have a sleeve board, you could stick a towel in here or something. You just want to make sure you're not creasing the other side of it. And we're going to iron open the seam. And we're going to do this on both sides. And then we're going to turn it around and do it on the opposite end. Now that we have the seams ironed open, we're going to fold it in half, wrong sides together. And we want to line up the raw edges here at the bottom. Double check your seam allowances in there to make sure that they haven't turned to one side. And now we're going to iron it in half. So put it back on your sleeve board and press. And work your way all the way around so that way you get a nice, strong, crisp edge at the edge of the cuff. And now your cuff is ready to sew. And once you have all of your buttons on, your dress is finished. You did it. Let's go try it on and check it out. Our dress is finished. It's looking gorgeous. I love our collar, our covered buttons, the details of the top stitching everywhere. And we have our gorgeous sleeve over here where the style line in the sleeve matches our princess line. And then we have a nice fitted tailored bodice with our princess lines. And then we have this really fun gathered hip detail. We also have these really fun cuffs on the sleeves. And then we have a nice flat front to the dress. The back of the dress is nice and fitted, and then we have our nice gathered sleeve in the back, and then our hip detail continues to the back, and we have a nice flat center back as well. And here's the dress on. It is so cozy and comfy to wear, and it fits so nice with the princess lines, and I just love these hidden inseam pockets. Look at all the volume in this dress. And that amazing sleeve with the cuff, perfect for fall and winter, 3/4 length sleeve on a dress. I know I cannot wait to make this out of some more fabrics. This is such a classic silhouette, and you can definitely have fun with it, change it up, make it more modern, make it your own style. Don't forget about the hacks about adding trim in the seams. Also, making it sleeveless, make it with no collar. Now, I've been looking at this for, like a month or so, and it looks very Victorian to me almost. Hear me out. When they used to wear the jackets that were fitted, and then they had the big skirts that would kind of come out of them, and with the sleeve. So as I've been working on it, I'm thinking it's kind of giving me Victorian vibes. And then if we go back even further, it's giving me 18th century giant panier vibes where they had like the giant hoops they wore on the sides. So you could even add some like crinoline to the sides of these and kind of pop them out, kind of go for like a party vibe, a little more runway. You can really play with the hips on this dress. So I hope you have so much fun with this design. I cannot wait to see what you come up with. Thank you so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. Don't forget, if you want to get this pattern, head on over to the Sewing Club. And if you enjoyed the video today, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you know when the new tutorials come out. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you so much for watching today. And if you want to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out my online and in-person sewing classes. There's links down below for everything. And if you want to know what's going on in the studio right now, well, make sure you check out the Instagram stories. Thank you so much for watching today. Bye!